everyone. I should get that on tape and have Melanie come to my classes, because they are thoroughly unimpressed by me, my college students. I am so delighted to be here today with people who have made the decision to come out on a Monday afternoon and hear me talk about something I feel very passionately about, which is this niche little part of theater history. I wonder how many of you have any exposure to Peter Brook, whether it be through some of his films or some of the things that he had directed. He is deceased now. It's okay if you haven't, and I'll go over who this person is, certainly. I chose this book, and I'm going to get into, part of the presentation is not just talking about this book, but also, we were just discussing how we're all a little neurotic. Part of the presentation is talking about the books I didn't choose and the bereavement process in that as well, because there's so many things that have influenced me as an educator, as a practitioner, as an artist. And the reason that I landed on this book is because it inspired in me reflexivity about my practice, but it also taught me that it's okay to disagree with a book, right? And there's no more important lesson to learn on the precipice of adulthood, which is when I first interacted with this book. Okay, so this is the newest cover. There's been a multitude of covers in various prints, but this is the newest cover, The Empty Space, a book about theater deadly, holy, rough, and immediate. We're not going to go in that order, and there is a reason for that, and I will explain that when we get to deadly theater. I loved also the little plug. The winner of multiple Tony and Emmy Awards, and I have to believe it wasn't just the publisher that insisted on that tag, but in fact, Mr. Brook himself. Here we go. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about what happened when I was contacted by the Friends of the Beaufort Library about this series, and they proposed that I come and speak, and I had an existential crisis about what book should I choose. This young lady in the middle is obviously Little Libby. You can tell from the onset I was pretty theatrical. When I was 10 years old, my grandparents lived on the Arlington-Cambridge line in Massachusetts, and we would visit them often. I didn't appreciate as much as I should. I certainly appreciate getting all of that exposure to so many things in New England now. But my parents decided we were going to take a trip up to Concord and Lexington, as one does, just a little day trip. And I remember I was 10 years old, I was almost 11, I was in 5th grade, I was going to be entering the 6th grade the following year. So I was leaving elementary school and going into middle school, which means I was a big kid now. And we went to a secondhand bookstore on the 2nd floor of this old building that had been, repurposed to be a commercial space. And my parents said that my brother, Tom, and I could choose a book. And my brother, of course, went right for the nonfiction, as he often did. He's 2 years older, and he was a award-winning mathlete. He also went to NYU, but he was a chemistry math double major. Slightly different. And I went right over to the drama section, and I remember pulling out, it had a frayed green spine, but it was a copy of The Tempest. And I wanted to read this. Because I really fancied myself an intellectual at the age of 10, and I knew that Shakespeare was important. And I had just started working, and when I started as a performer, it wasn't actually as an actor, I was working in opera. And so I was in the children's chorus of La Bohème and Carmen, and later I was a sprite in Magic Flute and Noah's Flood, and I worked on a number of different pieces, but I knew that I was interested in classical work. And so the first Shakespearean play that I ever read was The Tempest. And in it is this great line, my library was dukedom enough, right? That everything that I need is in books. And that resonated with me even then, even though Shakespeare is sort of picking at that, right? That Prospero really needed to think of all of the world, but he was so infatuated with knowledge. And I remember feeling that even at a young age, and I thought, oh, that might be an interesting thing to talk about. And I do love The Tempest, and it's not my favorite Shakespearean play, but it was my first, and it was my introduction. And then I thought, but you love it too much. It's precious. And there's something about convening friends here that, like, we need to be able to be, that we have to deconstruct sometimes too. Even the things that we love, the things that informed us as human beings moving through the world, we also have to see their flaws. And because this was the first thing that really made me feel like an intellectual and an artist, it's very hard for me to pick at it. I never teach the text, The Tempest, because I love it too much. So I didn't choose that text. And then I thought maybe I'll choose A Doll's House, because I thought it makes sense for me to choose a play text. And A Doll's House and Heinrich Ibsen in general, wow, unlocked a whole new world for me when I was in high school. And I was coming in contact with these texts and understanding theater history in better context. And I saw it as that slamming of the door and awakening in me this like feminist ideal, right? How we move from melodrama into psychological realism in one act. Really, it's Torvald and this Nora, this mouse of a woman, as she is described, suddenly becoming this behemoth on stage with these ideals of an entire feminist movement on her heels, or soon to be. And I love not just this text, but I've been able to play in it. And I played Mrs. Lind. I did not play Nora. And I got to explore in that performance jealousy, which I think is an interesting thing for us to talk about at any age. But then I thought, maybe I should leave play texts alone, because I didn't know how many of my Friends of the Beaufort Library are reading plays necessarily. And while it's the thing that I do, because this is the thing that I teach, I thought, maybe I should think about a text that sort of lives as a playbook for a practitioner, but also is sort of toying with theoretical paradigms. And that's an interesting confluence, especially when I think so much of what I do in terms of my creative output might not be thought of as traditional scholarship, but how much I'm interfacing with those things on a daily basis. So we'll move on. Here is slightly older Libby. This picture was taken when I was 14 years old. It was my first real commercial headshot. It was taken in Boston by a really lovely photographer. And it is the headshot that I used to audition for NYU. I applied to one university, which, looking back on it, I would not recommend. I should have diversified, but I knew from the time that I was 10, in fact, walking up those steps of that Concord bookstore, that NYU was the only place that I wanted to go. When my brother was accepted as a math major, he added chemistry in his third year so that he could extend his time, because he had so many college credits, even 20 plus years ago, when dual enrollment was not as in vogue, that he needed to add a second major in order to extend his time at university. I think that might have killed my parents, but he enjoyed his fourth year of college. I cried for 3 days when he got in because he was stealing my dream. Now I'm very grateful that we were both at the same institution, but at the time I really felt like he had taken the rug out from underneath me. And so I thought about the books that had been selected for us in that first year of college, because here I am, a college teacher. It makes sense for me to be thinking about talking about some of those books and how they've influenced me when I was 18 and how they still influence me. The book that was given to all first-year NYU students was Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake. If you have not read it, or if you have not read any of her work, I cannot recommend it more. She is a beautiful writer, and it was a challenging book for a multitude of reasons. And she is a lovely human being. I actually got to meet her. She came to my acting studio, which I'm not sure why, but I remember she was pregnant, I think, with her second child at the time, and I remember there was already these ideas of the conflation of gestation in terms of ideas and in terms of pregnancy and being fecund, literally and figuratively in that moment, and I was just so in awe of her, and I thought, I want to be like that. I want to be someone who can pursue the things that I feel passionately about, the things that I want professionally, and I also want to be a mom, which I got to do, which is kind of nice, it's amazing. But then I thought, no, I'll choose something that relates to theater. And then I thought about, I went to Tisch, and I thought about the book that was assigned to us for our acting studio, which was Stella Adler's The Art of Acting. Are any of you, I know we have some performers here, but I wonder, and I know I've seen some performers out there, but would any of you define yourself, at least part of your identity, as an actor or performer? Wonderful. Oh, cool. Excellent. Excellent. I don't know whether you've ever read The Art of Acting. It mostly goes through some of the lessons that she taught to some of her first-year students in the acting studio. And I don't know if any of you know anything about Stella Adler, an incredible artist, an incredible theater teacher, a very mean person. And so that is sort of captured, and that was at a time when the master teacher, in order to mold the student and break down their ego, there was this sense that we must be mean to our students, which has very much informed my own practice in terms of pedagogy, because I recognize I don't want to be like that. As much as I loved my master teachers, and that's what we were told to call them, they were the masters, they were the teachers. I wanted to lead my classrooms with kindness. Anyways, so that very much influenced me as an educator, and certainly as a theater practitioner. What I loved about Stella Adler's book, and it took me a long time, maybe even into my tenure at USCB, to define what it is about Adler methodology that moves me. And it is a methodology that believes in creation based on imagination. I know you thought you were coming here to hear just about the empty space, but all of these things intertwine, of course. Adler was touching on something that remains unnamed, but it is that we must understand the social sciences and the humanities, and really, we must understand truths about life and live our lives in order to be good artists. But so much of what her book is ethnographic work, which we find in the study of sociology, and psychoanalysis, which we find in the study of psychology. And that always sort of, I don't know, it fueled me, because it made it okay for me to be intellectual in a practice that is so often just thought of as feeling, right? And I wanted to find the marriage of those things. Well, the third book, and I'm sure you've guessed it, that we had to read was The Empty Space. And that was required of all students in Tisch, not just in my acting studio, but across the different disciplines, including film studies and photography and theater. And I remember being, jarred by the fact that so much consideration was given to what is theater. And it's Peter Brook's treatise, right? This is his mission, his vision for what theater can be. And theater to that point had been the different productions that I have been directed in. I had a stake in those things. I was a stakeholder as a performer, but I didn't get to define them. And so that was really exciting to me, that they were saying, you are an artist now, and it's time for you to decide what this thing is going to be in your life. It's your responsibility to do that. This is the first line, which I remember I read it maybe a dozen times. And I was so struck by it, but also so confused by it. And I'm going to read it to you because I just absolutely adore it. I can take any empty space and call it a bare stage. A man walks across this empty space while someone else is watching him, and this is all that is needed for an act of theater to be engaged. And I had worked in theaters outside of traditional prosceniums, which is like, we've got the picture frame and everything is happening and there's a fourth wall, right? I had worked in theater in the round. I had worked in alley theater ways. I had worked in different spaces, but they were all traditional theater spaces. And when I thought of theater, I thought of commercial theater when I was 18. And all of a sudden, I started to think of theater as being a part of this nebulous idea of performance studies. And that shifted. It was a paradigm shift for me. I became curious, certainly, but I think it gave me pause, because if there's no definite thing, what are we doing here? And so it was both exciting, but also terrifying that we can blow up a definition and create a new one for ourselves. And I'm sure as I look out in this audience of lives I can tell well lived, you've probably gone through this a number of times in your own lives. But when I'm 18, the sheltered 18-year-old kid who thinks of herself as very worldly because at 10 years old she read The Tempest, I don't think I was quite ready for what NYU was going to offer me. And this was a really good way to shake me into accepting a path that was unexpected. This is Peter Brook. He's British. His parents were refugees. Peter Brook's parents were Jewish refugees, and they found their way to England, and he was a very well-educated man. And was able to study languages at Oxford, I believe, and he became a theater practitioner, and really right out of the gate from his graduation was able to sort of work with some of the preeminent classical companies in England. But he, not unlike a lot of people during that time, they were dissatisfied with the status quo, and they wanted something that was more, this word comes up a lot, transcendent. He wanted something that was almost spiritual in the exchange. And what I realize now, and the biggest draw from me from the text, and as I think about the things that I agree with and that which I refute in his writing, is how important the audience is, right? It takes the onus of that experience from the performer, and also it ascribes all of that importance to the audience. Not that you owe me anything. He would say that you didn't, but then in one of his chapters, he would say the audience owed us more as performers, which is something I disagree with. But he makes the audience a necessary part of that equation, that everything we do is together, and that you are an important participant, an important player in the work that we do here in the theater. It is a discourse like any other. And I thought, wow, it's not just laughs and applause. It's everything. That's why we're doing this thing. Anyhow, he is very influenced by Artaud, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and he's very influenced by Grotowski, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And he wants this sort of deconstructive theater, and he wants to sort of shake up the canon, and he does this by directing only plays in the canon. Right? But he travels quite a bit, and he sees quite a bit of the world, and he's fascinated in what he would call world theater, which I think it's unfair to ascribe that moniker to performance practices in other places, because what they're doing doesn't fall neatly within our ideas, a Western idea of theater. But he does these talks after he has directed, and he's gotten enormous commercial success with his work with the Royal Shakespeare Company in the early 60s, and he has this series of talks that he does throughout England at some institutions of higher education, some of the best known institutions of higher education, both in terms of the study of drama, like the text, but also for actor training. And he does these talks to fund a trip to Afghanistan, because he wants to go and study performance practices there. And it is from these talks that we get what has become the empty space. Oh, okay, I don't know, that's slightly odd. The first one that we're going to talk about is holy theater, or theater of the invisible made visible. And so what he is interested in holy theater is something that is a ritual, that is transcendent, and that creates communion in the relationship between the audience and the players and each other, the text and the performance. Everything becomes elevated through something that is almost spiritual. And we have here, I love that they're all in black and white because it looks so dramatic, but we have here some of the performances and some of the playwrights and some of the performers that he talks about as really living within this type, this mode of theater, holy theater. And so we have first the plays of Samuel Beckett. Because what he's interested in holy theater is that which is stripped down to its essence, whatever that means, right? And we have this idea. Now, Samuel Beckett's a really interesting figure. I don't know, was anybody able to go and see Waiting for Godot, the recent production? Okay, did you see the recent one, or have you seen other iterations of it? Okay, yeah, of course. And some are better than others, I think we can admit, because I think one of the things that's really wonderful about that play is the humor that is in it, and it should have moments of immense levity and then of like desolate isolation and sadness, because that is human existence, I think, in his eyes. As a writer, he was very particular about everything. Samuel Beckett, he created these scripts that were blueprints for a performance, and God forbid anybody go off that blueprint, because he believed that the infrastructure for the performance, it needed to be on solid ground. And if anyone had any sort of artistic difference or had set these things in a different place, or who had veered even slightly in terms of their vision, they were desecrating what was this holy text, right? And so as an actor, it's kind of fun to work on some of Beckett's work, but it's also, it can be very stifling because it's so prescriptive. At this moment, we say this word with our eyes cast upward. At this line, make sure that your head turns slightly stage left, and then your eyes shoot to the right. I mean, like, it literally is that, almost like a symphony, right? Like every movement, everything is so laid out. And from it, we have this sort of barren landscape. And yet, Brook would argue that it is from that we experience that transcendence. I have seen some incredible performances of Beckett. I also know that he, not unlike other playwrights, have completely demolished productions because they have decided to go with different casting choices, choosing to explore females in what had been traditionally male roles. This is an instance of Edward Albee, but I think it is the same sort of scrutiny over their intellectual property that when a character was cast as a person of color, a production was shut down entirely because that was not the vision that the playwright had. I guess my thought is, then just write a book, right? If you need it to be, you have such a chokehold on the work and you don't want it to be collaborative, then why would you engage with a collaborative art? But from this we have holy theater, and it jars in the audience these feelings of eternity. Then we have Merce Cunningham, who of course was a dancer and had sort of like functioned on the precipice of dance and theater, which so many of the modern dancers did. We could say the same of Martha Graham. Do any of you know James Duffy? He has the store, yes, the store downtown. Duffy is I have 3 little boys, and he is my youngest child's, I think he would be okay with me telling this story. He is my youngest child's godfather. When he was a little boy, his father was on the board of the St. Louis Opera, and he was cast as one of the children in the opera. And Martha Graham directed the performance, and she hated him. Which I sort of love. And then he really didn't do any theater or performance stuff until he did Grease here. And now he is my muse. I love that man. Anyhow, we have this beautiful confluence of feeling and movement and narrative that are happening in these new dance pieces that are functioning outside of traditional ballet, right? And we're experiencing what our bodies can do when we throw them at each other. And how, physics and the sublime can sort of occur from these moments of collision. And Peter Brook is just fascinated with Merce Cunningham. And I think part of it is that it stripped away all of the affect. We just have bodies on stage moving and feeling. And that is transcendent for him. And then we have up here a production of a Grotowski piece. Jerzy Grotowski is kind of a complicated figure in theater history, not unlike Artaud. And Grotowski is very much influenced by Artaud. He is also influenced by socialist and communist ideas that are sort of taking hold in and the revolt against these things, but also the adherence to them in Eastern Europe. Like, how can we reappropriate these things that have stifled us into something that can be productive? And so he has these commune of performers that go and train in the woods, and he's actually quite cruel to them, both physically and mentally. And he strips them, again, of their ego. And from this come these performances that are laid bare, their humanity laid bare. But of course, we understand that is just conditioned behavior. These people have been ultimately almost tortured, and then they are the perfect puppets for what he envisions in these performances. So interestingly enough, what Brook is talking about in Holy Theater as being this communal, transcendent experience, in some ways is mirroring the very things that he is fighting against. Right? If we think about spiritual or religious structures that can be seen as oppressive, he's saying, well, this is the opposite of that. And yet, as so often happens, it is appropriating all the same tactics in order to create this product. So that's Holy Theater, which I should say, I realize I'm being kind of flippant about it. There's something, especially for that 18-year-old girl who felt the need to constantly be feeling something, that there was a correct thing to feel. There's something about the exploration of Holy Theater that made me aware that any feeling was necessary and important for a performance, even if it seemed incongruent to that which the playwright had laid out, right? Or even the absence of what we should feel in certain moments is feeling enough. And that it continues to blow my almost 40-year-old mind. Moving on. The rough theater, which is popular, immediate, and unrefined. During this time period in the 60s, we have the open theater, the living theater. Performance art is kind of becoming a thing. I'm standing on my tiptoes so I can see you. I'm quite petite, but anyhow. Rough theater is pushing back against the expectations of proper theatrical tradition and form, which I think is sort of interesting because the proper traditions that he is speaking of are also not that long-standing, right? Like theater as an idea, this concept of theater, if we're looking at the evolution of Western theater, is constantly evolving. And genres are constantly emerging and fighting against each other. And the place of the audience and the performer and the playwright, and then in the 19th century, this idea of director really emerges as the visionary. They're constantly sort of at war with each other, but he really loves the things that are coming out of these new movements that are spontaneous and jarring to the audience and their expectations. They're not neat, which I think is what many of us think of when we go to see certain shows. And so he is, of course, obsessed with Brecht. And then his own production of Peter Weiss's Murat Sade, which we'll talk about in just a second, which is an incredible piece of theater, and also the film. I don't know if any of you have seen it. Okay. So how many of you have any knowledge of Bertolt Brecht? Yes, we have our, okay, yes. There's no reason that you should or should not know about Brecht, but Brecht is, he is a German, Brecht, obviously, a German practitioner that is functioning in the mid-20th century, very influenced by the things that are happening in Western Europe, specifically Germany at this time. It is necessary to understand that theater artists are widely persecuted by both sides for a multitude of reasons during this time. And so they're between their own convictions and feelings and also a state that is constantly trying to either ascribe their own sort of propaganda onto the performance form, or in some ways trying to restrict that which they are exploring. Brecht comes up with this particular theater that has to do with alienation, that he wants to get his audience right to the edge of feeling and then immediately undercut that feeling. So we have a mother who is a wartime profiteer who is trying to do what's right for her children who are ill. And we have this maybe sympathy for what it is that she's doing, and then we're immediately undercut by a moment where she sells out her children, right? Or when we start to feel deeply for a character, and then all of a sudden there's a song, like that isn't sung as an extension of that character's feeling, but as a narration or like of exposition, right? And so we're constantly brought to this moment of catharsis only to be denied. And it is through that jarring time in communion, in the space, that the roughness of it, that we come to understand ourselves and our community better, the ways in which we treat and mistreat each other. It's kind of cool. I mean, Brecht, like all human beings, is a complicated figure, where his sympathies lied, how he treated the artists that he worked with. It's complicated. Okay, Murat Sade. I would not recommend watching this on an empty stomach, you really have to be in the right state of mind, because it is visually And in terms of the actual content, very upsetting. It is an exploration of the last days of this revolutionary who has a skin disease, so he constantly needs to be in this bath, right, taking care of this festering skin disease. And it's performed by, the conceit is that it is performed by the inmates or the patients. They would consider them, these were people who were made to go to an asylum. They're convicted of the mental illness, and so it is punitive. It is not for care at this time. And they are working under the direction of the Marquis de Sade, who, as many of you know, did spend much time in a mental institution, an asylum. And so what we have in these performances is the story. We are looking through what is ultimately a very violent tale of this French revolutionary through this lens of another layer of violence perpetrated by the society who has said, because this is a time, it's written in a time of Foucault, right? We've constructed madness, right? So the violence is by us believing these people are unwell, but then also the unwell patients who take violence against each other. And so we are constantly brought into this story, and we begin to understand these characters and feel for these. We feel for Cordelia. There's a very violent rape that happens. And all of it is quite graphic. And at the end of the performance, which Brook talks about kind of extensively, we have this sense, this is where he sort of falls in, that this moment is categorized as rough, because I think he would also argue that is immediate theater. That everything falls into pandemonium. We get to the end of this tale, and the actors who are playing the patients, they start to revolt against their captors or the healthcare providers, however you see them. And it becomes very chaotic and very frightening, because at least in the first productions, before it moved from the West End to Broadway, there was a sense of immediacy, like the audience was quite close to the performance. And we see that in the film adaptation. And there's just this chaos erupts, and it's violent, and it is encroaching on the space of the audience. And then all of a sudden we have the stage managers come out almost like referees with whistles, and they stop the performance. And the audience is left with a moment of, well, how do we behave in this? And so applause erupts. And then the players, including the stage managers who are part of this performance, start clapping at the audience for clapping, because they're doing their part well. That's rough. I would describe that as rough. And yet, what can we do, maybe in less violent means, with this sense of immediacy, where we're challenging our roles and the boundaries between performance, player, and audience? Maybe it doesn't have to be so violent. Maybe there's some other things that can kind of emerge from this. And then we have the immediate theater, which is present, visceral, and ephemeral. It comes and it goes, right? And that's what Brook would argue is his form of theater, of course, because it is the confluence of all of these things together. It's holy and it's rough. Right, he's doing it right. Which, of course, if I'm going to write a book about my practice, well, maybe I wouldn't, because I can be a little self-depreciating, but I think it makes sense for this man to be like, and I'm doing it right, and here's what you can do to do it correct as well. Okay, so the examples of immediate theater in his book are very much his work, which we'll talk about in a second, because I do want to talk about the first chapter that he writes. It is the longest chapter in the book. It is the first 40 pages, and boy, is it a slog to get through. And so I encourage you, if this interests you at all, or if even just sort of the breaking down of paradigms interests you, this is a good book to read. But this first chapter is hard because he's so hypocritical. And this is where it was really hard for me as an 18-year-old who was going to NYU because they wanted to engage with what would be commercial theater, because I wanted to be a theater artist, and I needed to make money. Right? A lot of my classmates, and this is sort of the odd thing about going to a university like NYU, a lot of my classmates could just sort of buy into this because they didn't need to make money. They were afforded a liberal arts education because they had the means to pursue it. They believed in the starving artist because they would never actually be starving. It was another part they could try on, right? They could live in what they considered modern-day Bohemia, which was Williamsburg, where the apartments were more expensive than Manhattan, right? But they took the L train out there so they could really feel like they were suffering. And I don't mean to be disparaging about my classmates. It's just a fact of life. Some people are allowed to pursue these avenues, and some people have to fight for them. And I was somewhere in between those things because my parents were able to send us through much sacrifice of their own, but I was able to attain these things without too much discomfort on my own part. I would not say that was the case for my parents. They're good parents. Anyhow, and so this was hard for me, especially when I started looking into Peter Brook and seeing how he made all of his money. So, deadly theater is repetitive, commercial, uninspired, hackneyed. It is the exchange of capital, but not ideas or understanding. It is the people who go to theater on a Friday night so that they can talk about it at brunch on Sunday. Those people also pay my bills. I don't mind those people at all. And the thing is, I feel like what upset me so much about his take on deadly theater is, again, he gained his success through the direction. One of his first crowning achievements was Midsummer Night's Dream. And he just completely lambasts Shakespeare. Not Shakespeare as the writer, but Shakespeare as a current, in its current consumption, its current iteration and consumption. And I think that's kind of rich. And he, as you saw on the front cover, it says, he's won multiple Tony and Emmy Awards. Obviously important to him, right? I don't know what speaks of commercial success outside of an award system that only acknowledges commercial success. It was tricky for me too, because he speaks disparagingly of opera, which was my first love. And he himself gained enormous notoriety in his direction of Carmen. I think he also directed a production of La Bohème. He is doing mainstream operas. It's not as though he's going in and doing these new art house productions. These are, we're talking about Puccini, right? My kids know songs by Puccini, and they are 3, 6, and 8. And then Shakespeare, which again, my 10-year-old self was dying, hearing that the current iterations of Shakespeare are uninspired, that people are just going for that capital of experience rather than the actual emotional context and the exchange of ideas that are potentially present. And then he doesn't mention this because Neil Simon is happening kind of in tandem with this, but I just feel like he would hate Neil Simon. And I love Neil Simon. And I think of like what playwright has invited more people to the theater than Neil Simon. What do we see when we go to community theaters? Neil Simon. And I can't tell you, Lost in Yonkers, Bella's monologue about desiring agency, nothing has ever resonated or hit me like that monologue. And it's just in this frumpy family comedy, right? Where there's actual heart present. And gosh, isn't that so sentimental? But I guess I say, what's wrong with entertainment? Why is it bad for us to go see a musical? I recently went to go see, my friend was the dance captain, and he was also one of he was a swing, but he was an understudy for the male lead. Death Becomes Her. So much fun, and I've never felt more in community with an audience than in that production. And there were moments that were rough. I mean, maybe not what was happening on stage, but the actual, like, visceral experience of the audience as, I don't want to ruin it for anyone, but there's this great scene when, I'm sure some of you have seen the movie too, when one of the women falls down the stairs, and they hired an Olympic gymnast, a male Olympic gymnast, to take on this. I mean, it lasts for like 3.5 minutes of her going down the stairs and the splits and the body breaking down the stairs. And I mean, like, literally, I watched people who did not know each other, did not come into the theater together, grasping each other as it was happening. And in that moment, I thought, well, this is kind of transcendent, isn't it? In this, what would be argued as an uninspired and hackneyed production. Theater has so much potential and possibility. It doesn't have to be one thing, right? And I think Peter Brook was really arguing not just for an intellectual theater, but for an intellectual audience. And he was negating that which an audience brings to bear on the experience. He was underestimating them. And so for me, when I think about theater, this is where I'll sort of leave you, and then we can talk if you'd like, because I was told to leave 10 minutes. When I think about theater and why I continue to do these things and why applied theater, the way that I take theater principles and role play, and I help to establish that in different learning environments across the disciplines, there's so much possibility if there's trust between us as performers and those that are making sure we look good, the directors, the designers, between the playwright who gifts their words to the performers to envision in a way they might not have, and the audience. That the audience trusts me with their time. I should do the same. And that is what I gleaned from this book. It's a good, I promise you, it is a good read. I feel like I've just like sort of torn it apart. For the book list, if you were thinking, like, I've mentioned so many different things during this talk, I thought I would give some recommendations, or at least things that I talked about. We have The Tempest, A Doll's House, The Namesake, Art of Acting. Look at that picture of Stella Adler. I feel like it tells us everything we need to know about this woman. Of course, we talked about Romeo and Juliet, or I showed you a picture of Romeo and Juliet in this last slide. Here, I'll go back just for, I saw somebody taking a picture. I don't want to interrupt them. This is a scene from Romeo and Juliet, and I know it looks like the balcony scene, and it is a balcony scene, but it is not Act 2, Scene 2. This is the moment after their night together, after she has found out that he has killed Tybalt. And he is descending, not ascending. And she asks if they will ever see each other again. And then she says that she thinks she has a prophetic soul because it's almost like looking at him in his grave. And I remember, I've played Juliet a number of times, and this was the most difficult scene to get through, and also the most rewarding, because I think it is the one that the audience realized, oh, things have really gone awry. And it's not the one that they remember, right? When the actual unaliving happens at the end, the suicides. It happens right smack dab in the middle. It's after a big fight. Anyhow, okay. Lost in Yonkers, love this play. I really do love Neil Simon. Theater in its double, we didn't talk too much about it, but we did talk about Jerzy Kwiatkowski, who is enormously influenced by Anthony Artaud. Artaud, all of these things kind of like are constantly striking moments in my own life. I was able to study in Bali for a summer, and I worked with the mask maker who had made masks for Peter Brook and his Mahabharata, Ida Bagusa. He has since passed away. But Artaud was enormously influenced by Balinese opera, which I was able to go study, and so that was kind of interesting. But he talked about a theater of cruelty, which very much influenced Jerzy Kwiatkowski's Towards a Poor Theater. Not on here if you are interested in any of these things, or if you were an educator or are an educator, is Augusta Boal's Poor Theater, where oh God, I've just lost the name of it. Augusta Boal is he's a South American theater practitioner who talks about bringing theater, that it should be community building. But he's pulling on these things, but taking it as a glass half full kind of thing. So I would recommend that if these seem too depressing to you. Mother Courage and Her Children, and of course Murat Saad, which again, we have to be in the right mind frame to, to consume. Anyhow. I wonder, does anybody have any questions or thoughts on any of this? It's a lot. Yes? Yes, okay, so yes. Of course, because we have the same sort of landscape. It is an asylum. We have the sense of what is madness that is present. I would say the distinct difference of the two theatrical experiences is one is very much rooted in psychological realism. So Cuckoo's Nest is really sort of pulling on the principles of that genre, whereas Murat Saad is sort of like playing against it. And so we constantly have these moments where the actors are sort of engaging in realism and then are undercut because they're playing multiple roles. They are actor, playing inmate, playing character in the production. So we're sort of like vacillating between these roles. Whereas we always know Nurse Ratched is Nurse Ratched. Yeah. Although that would be an interesting production, wouldn't it? Cool. Yeah. Yes. Oh yeah, Ionesco is so great. Right, so we have theater of the absurd, which people would say is like we're going against psychological realism, but of course, I think Ionesco would say that we're just taking it to its natural conclusion, that it actually is more realistic than the things that we see in psychological realism. But we do have this sense of, it's jarring because it's not functioning within the confines of the genre of theater that we're used to, which is psychological realism. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you, first of all, for your such lovely and animated...
Oh gosh, thank you.
But in relationship to yourself and your students now, do you feel your students think they are as worldly as you felt you were then?
No.
And how do you go
Yeah.
no? And so how do you address them in class and in assignments?
It is the exact opposite, and yet I look at them and they seem so much more worldly than I was. I think part of it is that I teach at a 4-year access institution. My students, I have a lot of first-generation college students. My parents both went to college. My mom went to Providence College and then got her master's from Salve Regina. My father went to Northeastern. We knew we were going to go to college. We knew that that would be an opportunity afforded to us. A lot of my students, they don't know they're going to get to go until they walk in that first classroom. Not all, but I would say a large part of my students that this is you don't know what you don't know. And so when I talk about my experiences, just being in New York even, it seems like another world to them. And then I have to explain, New York is just another community. It's just another place, and there's no hierarchy in places. It's just another place. And because they've heard of it, and maybe I haven't heard of Hampton or wherever they might be from, or I don't know them as well, it feels small, but it's not. And so what I feel like I'm constantly trying to do is lift them up, bolster them, to understand that my experiences are my own. I'm also almost 40, and they are not that. And their lived experiences could topple mine in many ways, right? And that they are impressive in their own right. Yeah. You know, they live in a digital age. And so they know a lot more than I knew. I was very sheltered. Facebook, I was one of the first 4 or 5 schools to Facebook. You know, it was Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and NYU were of the first iteration of Facebook. And so even though I was a part of a network that first semester of school, it was a network it was a very small group. Now they have connections to everything and everyone. But they don't see themselves as part of it, and I think that's what I'm constantly fighting against. You know so much, you deny your knowledge and your capacity. Yeah. Thank you for that question, that's great. My students are incredible. I cannot speak more highly of them. Although they are sometimes annoyed with how animated I am. I teach early in the morning, and I think for some of them it's a lot.
I was told that last year I did the first theater presentation.
Yes.
We talked about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
Oh, so great, yes. I know.
I just wanted to say that we have at least half of those works and many more plays at the Beaufort bookstore.
Ooh.
We'll get the rest of them for you.
Oh, yes, please do. Oh, that's that's heartening. Thank you. Yeah, and also Tom Stoppard is so great. And I would argue he really does live in immediate theater, although long-winded. His plays are long. But it's amazing, even with some of these plays that, it depends on the production, I suppose, and the aptitude of the artists that are, it's not just whether they're well-trained, it's whether they understand the humor that's present in it, because it is absurd, right? He is dealing within psychological realism this idea of this undercurrent of absurdity that we all feel throughout our lives. And so you really need an adroit player. But it's fantastic, so funny. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead is just great. It's really, really good. Yes?
Which of the arts do you see your children going into?
Such a great question. My eldest son, Marlowe, named after Christopher Marlowe, he's a creator of worlds. He calls it, when he's sharing things with us, he was in imaginary. And he has this really vivid, just imaginary life that I think will eventually go from his mind to paper. He's interested in performance, but I think he's more interested in world building. Yeah, and I think that will happen in terms of creative writing, would be my guess. My middle son, Barrett, named for Elizabeth Barrett Browning, we are obviously college professors, my husband and I both. He's musical and has always been percussive in all things. He is also on the spectrum, and so he's a sensory seeker, and a lot of that comes from the creation of sound. And so that's what he enjoys. Music is the thing that he enjoys. My youngest son, Garrick, named for David Garrick, who was a famous actor in the 18th century, 19th, is a tyrant. And so I can imagine him doing nothing else but directing. He's already directing us at the house. But they all have visual arts aptitude as well, and they love going to consume art. that it's something they love going to the Sea Islands Gallery. We're really lucky to be embedded in a community that has such an active visual arts scene, and my kids can't get enough of it. And it's amazing because they create connections between their lives. I mean, when they're young, they're sponges, and everything is full of possibility and connection. It's as we get older that we turn we filter everything. And so, like, I'm constantly trying to, like, learn to be more like my kids, because everything is a world of yes and. Yeah. Thank you. That's such a nice question. Thank you.